Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much, Fred, and the American Physical Society for this invitation. I want to reiterate something, an idea that I often say to my students. The scientists are going to be fundamental in this field. They have been fundamental for many, many years. Your job is an important one, and trying to forge dialogue between policy and science is indispensable. And so I want to thank you for taking the time today to listen to a bunch of political scientists, policy experts who don't necessarily speak your language, but want to get into a dialogue with you all. So the assignment I was given by Fred is a difficult one. I actually have to explain in less than 30 minutes what happened, why are we in a massive war in Europe, probably the largest event after World War II. Now, let me put this into context and say that we are convening today at a very difficult moment. 1 year on, there is no prospect for a peace deal. In fact, there is not even an opening for a ceasefire. It is very clear that the conflict is slowly internationalizing, from Belarus to China, from India, from Iran to North Korea, and everything in between. More and more countries are now playing a role into what promised to be just a special operation. And this war is having also major consequences on the multilateral security architecture. The UN Security Council is completely paralyzed. The G20 couldn't even agree on a consensus statement. But also other international organizations, the International Atomic Energy Agency, my colleagues in Vienna tell me that they have not been able to pass one resolution because the Ukraine war is so divisive between the West and the East. And it's very unclear what is the future of the multilateral cooperation across many domains precisely because of this. But the humanitarian consequences have been even more staggering. 7 million Ukrainians are today either refugees or internally displaced people. In some parts of Ukraine, 60% of the infrastructure has been destroyed. 600,000 Russians have fled the country. Major food and energy crises have affected especially the most vulnerable countries around the world. So it is fair to say what happened, right? What kind of turn did we take to get here? For the Ukraine war has fundamentally shattered a very important belief that us Europeans held dearly for many, many years, that the old continent had finally learned to live together in peace, that the old animosity that led to 2 world wars were finally behind us, and that we have learned actually coexistence and the fact that international law should be the principle of international affairs. But we were wrong. So what I want to do today is trying actually to take issues with 2 competing narratives that exist today in the media. And I don't think they're necessarily incorrect. I think they're just partial and not comprehensive enough to explain the Ukraine war and its origins. Now, one of the common narratives is NATO enlargement. If only we could stay out of East Europe, Russia would have not felt the insecurity that NATO enlargement caused, and everything would be fine. The second narrative is it's all because of Putin. If only Putin was going to go away, we would live in a world of peace and security for all. Now, I don't say these narratives are wrong. I just think they are partial. And if taken as singular factors, do not explain the Ukraine war. I think the Ukraine war needs to be understood as a perfect storm, as a convergence of 3 factors that have long and deep-seated historical roots and fundamentally flare up at the same time. And let me repeat, these are elements that have been around for a long time. This didn't start yesterday or in 2014 with the Crimea war. These are actually deep-rooted issues that we have also somehow struggled with. The first one is a Russian leadership ideology that is fundamentally unable and unwilling to accept the independent identity of former Soviet republics. Yes, Putin might be the problem, but the vision is not only Putin's vision. It is a vision of the elite in Russia that believes that Ukraine is not even a country. The second factor is the open door policy of both NATO and the European Union. And in that is not only NATO enlargement that certainly caused security concerns and fears among the Russian elite, but it was also the belief that liberal institutions function with the idea of open door policies. We don't go out and recruit members, but we allow sovereign states to apply for membership to any international organization they choose to be part of. And the third element, which I think is very important and is actually not very well discussed in the Western media, is the rise of both Ukrainian patriotism and rising nationalism. I think these factors converge together to generate what ended up basically being the militarization of a long-standing crisis. Now, we all know how it went. On February 22nd, 2022, sitting comfortably in his office at the Kremlin, Putin announced to the nation and to the world that the Russians will embark in a special operation to, as he said it, denazify Ukraine. But at the center stage of the speech that Putin gives is actually a different argument. He says, I would like to emphasize that Ukraine is not just a neighboring country. It is an inalienable part of our history, culture, and spiritual space. These are our comrades, those dearest to us, not only colleagues, friends, and people who once served together, but also relatives, people bound by blood, by family ties. So, he continues, I will start with the fact that modern Ukraine was entirely created by Russia, or more precisely by Bolshevik communist Russia. Then he goes on in a bizarre tirade against Lenin, and he said, look, it was actually Lenin who, in order to appease these nationalistic forces in the outskirts of the Russian, the Soviet Union, decided to concede a little bit of autonomy to these regions. But remember, the point was autonomy, not independence. Now, the idea that Putin actually presented on February 22nd, 2022 was not his, and it was not new. And in fact, many scholars agree that a central feature of Russian great power policy is the belief in the primacy and greatness of the Russian state raised almost to the level of secular religion. In contemporary Russia, as it was true for the Soviet and pre-Soviet era, the state's greatness subordinates everything else, including rights of citizens and the freedom of what we would call the neighboring countries or the near abroad. The policy that has come to be known as Putinism in reality has long roots in Russian thinking. And it has three elements. The first one is many of the Russian policymakers, this goes back actually many, many decades. It really goes beyond Putin. The Russian foreign policy fundamentally does not believe in equality among states. There are states that are more equal to others, and great power politics shape international affairs. The second principle is that the near abroad or the neighboring countries or the former Soviet Republic, whatever you want to call them, are in a patronage relation to the state, to the Russian state. What this means is that countries like Ukraine or Belarus, for example, could be autonomous in some sectors, but they will always be servant to the Russian state in two main domains, economy and security. For that reason, for many, many years, the Ukrainians actually enjoy a very comfortable energy subsidies coming from Russia. And that was also why the Ukrainians, for example, had a very specific role, a status within the Russian project of Eurasia, which was supposed to be the alternative to the European Union. And so the idea for these countries is you can be autonomous in some policies like migration, for example, but on security and economy, you will always be in a patronage relationship with the Russian Federation, with the core state. The third principle of this policy is a very disturbing one for us. The belief that any idea of Ukraine sovereignty is a fundamental West construct and is part of what Putin referred to as the anti-Russia project. So every kind of freedom that emboldened the Ukrainians, so every kind of project that strengthened the sovereignty of the country has to be seen as a Western manipulation. These are the three principles that Putin fundamentally espoused with the special operation, but these are actually not new principles. In fact, the difficult relation between Ukraine and before the Soviet Union, the Russian Empire, now Russian Federation goes back many, many centuries. For over 300 years, the Ukrainians were actually banned to publish in their own language. They were persecuted when they tried, for example, to rise up against the Russian Empire once or the Soviet Empire second. And who can forget, for example, this? If you haven't read this book, I would strongly recommend it, the Holodomor. The worst famine that was actually man-made, engineered by Stalin to actually destroy the rising nationalism within Ukraine. 4 million Ukrainians were wiped out, 13% of the population. This was, by the accounts of many historians, the very first man-made famine in Ukraine. So the issue that somehow Putin espoused, which was Ukraine is not even a country, is not his per se, goes back to generations of thinking, and also finds great support among, in fact, the Orthodox Church. Patriarch Kirill said it very clearly. So the belief that we just get rid of Putin and everything is going to be fine, in my view, fails substantially to understand an ideology that exists in Russia today and is way more mainstream than we like to believe. Now, the second factor is NATO enlargement, and we all know the history about this. Now, let me read what President Putin has said at some point about this. Not an inch to the east, we were told in 1990, Putin said in a December 2021 speech, but they cheated us vehemently and blatantly. Now, Putin has frequently referred to that specific expression, not 1 inch to the east, to basically said NATO just cheated the Russians. They basically lied to us, and they are not admitting it. But where does not 1 inch to the east comes from? It comes from this. Shortly after the Berlin Wall fell, but before actually the Soviet Union imploded, James Baker, President Bush Sr., Secretary of State, met with Soviet leader Gorbachev. Now, the Soviet leader had no illusion that he could prevent the unification of East and West Germany, but he wanted the reassurances that Germany, the newly reunified Germany, would not be entering into NATO. And during the meeting, Gorbachev says, you know, the reunification of the German state to be a part of NATO would rub defeat too harshly in the Russian faces. It might be better, Gorbachev said, to keep the new Germany neutral. To which Baker replied, well, a unified neutral Germany can actually be quite dangerous, because if we don't offer any security assurances, the Germans might go ahead and get nuclear weapons themselves. So Baker then asked Gorbachev, would you prefer to see a unified Germany outside of NATO, independent and with no US forces, or would you prefer a unified Germany be tied to NATO with assurances that NATO's jurisdiction would not shift 1 inch eastward from its present position? Now, of course, this was a question. It wasn't a pledge. Secretary Baker was in no position to pledge anything. And so Gorbachev thought a second and said, well, put it in this way, I would prefer the latter. And Baker said, I did too. But then back in Washington, Baker actually briefed President Bush, and President Bush had a very bad reaction, and he said, to hell with that. We prevailed, they didn't. We can't let the Soviets clutch victory from the jaws of defeat. And Secretary Baker never mentioned not 1 inch ever again. Now, the major position and the major step towards enlargement comes with the Clinton administration. In fact, the historians call the 1994 the Rubicon year, when the Clinton administration decided for the enlargement of NATO. But the way in which we have presented the NATO enlargement, in my view, does not capture exactly what happened within the Clinton administration. There were very acute discussions within the administration about whether it was a wise plan or an unwise plan. And some very important officials within the Clinton administration were, in fact, adamantly against it. For example, Secretary Perry, Secretary of Defense Perry, said that the number one priority for the United States in the post-Cold War should be actually to create a building relationship with Russia. And Eastern Europe had to be subordinated to their relation, the mutual relation with the Russians, especially because of nuclear reduction priorities. The Clinton administration went back and forth with very acute discussions, but the major role that was actually played in the NATO enlargement was in the United States. It was actually Lech Walesa, the president of Poland, who then came to see Clinton in 1993 and said, we all fear Russia. Let's not kid ourselves. Just because, the Cold War is ended, it doesn't necessarily mean it had transformed the nature of Russian politics. And when Russia will rise again, these are the statements that Walesa will make in 1993, Russia will turn against Poland and Ukraine, and we can't be defenseless. So then something bizarre happens, and I want to say to you, the young people here, they tell you often, never make decisions when you are drunk, and I actually want to present this as an example. Never make decisions when you are drunk. Now, on August 24, 1993, during a state visit to Poland, Yeltsin meets with Polish President Walesa, and they drink. 1 vodka, 2 vodka, 3 vodka, 4 vodka, and then they wine and dine and keep drinking. And Walesa at some point decides to bring up the question of Poland accession to NATO, and says to Yeltsin, Mr. President, would you accept to make a joint statement that Poland joining NATO is not in any shape or form a threat to any country, including Russia? Yeltsin, completely drunk, he was actually famous for this, he says, absolutely, my friend, no problem at all. Statement goes out, next day, massive hangover. Yeltsin wake up and his advisors are on fire, right? He just realized what he just did. He will try to take it back through letters. He will send a letter to President Clinton in September saying, we are sympathetic with the nostalgia of Eastern Europe, but NATO expansion is not the way. But what this episode that actually has made pages in history books revealed were two things. This was a very dramatic episode that, of course, we laugh about. Here's a drunk person, making a consequential decision for the security of his country. But there were two readings of this. The first one was in Russia. A young Putin saw this as an abysmal sign that Yeltsin was absolutely the wrong man for the project, and he was completely incompetent and unreliable. Right? So Putin will rise to power precisely as the opposition to this indisciplined behavior of President Yeltsin. But the second one was a clear sign for the United States that no Eastern European country would have ever accepted anything less than an accession to NATO. And so it began, where President Clinton started in reality talking to some of the Eastern European countries. At some point, they started proposing, for example, a slow accession to NATO, something that they call Partnership for Peace, with the idea that, for example, maybe we can bring together the former members of the Warsaw Pact and NATO. We try somehow to socialize and normalize Russia with it. So it was a project, in a way, where we could slow down the enlargement of NATO and try to bring Russia along. But it was almost impossible to convince mostly of the Eastern European countries. And in 1994, the meeting with Slovakia, Czech Republic, Hungary, and Poland fundamentally sealed the deal. And from then on, has been unstoppable. So, yes, there was a NATO enlargement, but there were actually mistakes and mishandlings on both sides. Now, let me finish with this, which I think is really, really important. Now, let's turn for a second in conclusion about Ukraine. What kind of role did Ukraine play in all this? Now, I want to mention this photo because it's very, very important. Now, in the tit for tat towards the NATO enlargement, a very important agreement was achieved, the so-called Budapest Memorandum. You've probably heard about this in the news. 1995, the Russian Federation, the United Kingdom, and the United States, fundamentally in exchange for Ukraine to enter into the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation Treaty and return nuclear weapons that belonged, in fact, to the Soviet Union to Russia. In exchange for this, the Ukrainians will receive a series of positive security assurances and negative security assurances. The three countries will refrain from invading or violating the territorial integrity of Ukraine. They will also refrain from imposing economic threats or grievances over the country. And they will somehow, come to the aid of Ukraine should they actually come under attack. This was in order to obtain a fundamental disarmament of Ukraine. During the Cold War, Ukraine was the third largest nuclear arsenal in the world after the United States and the Soviet Union, with 3,200 nuclear weapons stationed on the territory. Ukrainians didn't have control of the nuclear weapons, but they were actually in charge of the administration. The Budapest Memorandum is something that we counted on very, very dearly. And that's why today when we think about the potential proliferation consequences of this war, we think about all the countries that did receive this kind of security assurances and then actually got invaded or bombed, right? So if Russia has grievances over NATO enlargement, we have grievances about the Budapest Memorandum. Now I want to finish with this, which is probably the most politically sensitive issue. I think we have presented also domestic politics in Ukraine in a rather partial way. This is the image and vision and narrative that we normally like to think about when we think about Ukraine. This is a rising democracy, a young democracy that is fighting for its identity and its freedom. And in fact, Ukraine in the last 20 years have seen two major revolutions: upheaval, social demonstrations, social movements, youth activism. The Orange Revolution in 2004, followed by the Maidan Revolution, or the Revolution of Dignity in 2014. And the whole idea here was for a country who wanted to enter into the European Union or at least accede to a political and free trade agreement with the European Union, right? So in 2014, they ousted the president because Yanukovych decided not to sign the free trade agreement with the European Union. This is the story that we believe. This is the beautiful Ukraine fighting for an accession to the Western world. But there is also another narrative that has to be taken into consideration, especially for the Western audience, to understand what is happening. Exactly why the Orange Revolution, the Maidan Revolution was going on in the streets of Kiev and in many of the urban settings. There was another protest, many pro-Russian movements that were actually happening, particularly in the southeast belt of the country. These are regions, the Donbass region, the Lugansk region, the same regions that today we read about that have been, again invaded by Russia and they've been claimed as Russian territories, where the majority of people feel more Russian than they feel Ukrainians, where they've retained a Russian identity, where they've studied Russian history, and they do believe they would be better to live under Russian control instead of joining NATO or the West. And we have to be acknowledging these forces. So when we talk about the patriotism of Ukraine, I argue, sure, this is what the West sees. But what the West sees is a positive patriotism. The Russia instead believes is a patriotism against, for example, the pro-Russian forces that exist in the East and in the South. Right? So this clash of narratives within the Ukrainian domestic politics is extremely important. I want to finish with this. So what role did Zelensky play in all this? Zelensky comes about in a very difficult moment of Ukraine. He's a very young politician, but he's incredibly well known. And I don't know if you know the story of Zelensky. He's right, he's a comedian, but he plays actually this idea of building a national identity for Ukraine. So he's already in a way a media hero for many young people. He's incredibly well known and he's very well hated actually by the Russians. Now, Zelensky made a couple of moves that will, in my view, really trigger or accelerate the decision of invading the country. Number one, after 2014, the German Chancellor Angela Merkel is able to bring the Ukrainian and Russian forces together in trying to agree on the Minsk agreement and try somehow to carve out some autonomy in the pro-Russian regions. And what the Minsk agreement asks is for Zelensky and the Ukrainian government to allow a different status or a preferential treatment of these autonomous regions, more respect for the Russian languages and other things, in order somehow to, appease a little bit what is, a rising social movement pro-Russian. Zelensky arrives on the scene and he believes that the Minsk agreement is actually really dangerous because this could entrench even further pro-Russian forces. And he makes a very specific moves. He closed a series of pro-Russian TV channels. He also arrests a couple of oligarchs very, very close to Russia that were actually subsidizing a lot of pro-Russian propaganda. And he actually decides to undertake a massive security sector reform, because he believed that the Crimea War and these pro-Russian demonstrations have actually been, accelerated or promoted by Russia themselves. So he believes that the Russians has infiltrated his security forces. Now, nothing wrong with that. He's the president. He can decide the course of action. But by doing that, he has fundamentally reiterated this idea that the pro-Russian regions have no place in the rising nascent Ukrainian democracy that he is representing. So where do we go from here? Now, my colleagues will talk about nuclear risks. I've written as well about, what can happen. But let me say just a couple of words here. I think this is going to be a long, long war. And however this is going to end, I want you to leave today noting that these forces that are actually undergirding the Ukrainian war today are deep-rooted forces. These are ideological forces, these are religious forces, these are nationalistic forces that are not going to get away just with a ceasefire or a peace agreement. And even if you had removed Zelensky and Putin today, those forces would still exist. This, to me, should suggest that the post-European security architecture needs really to be a serious exercise in thinking about all the grievances that we have left untapped and unaddressed over the last 3 or 4 decades. And how the war ends, in my view, will determine very much the future of Ukraine, the future of Russia, the future of Europe, but it will also have major impacts on the global order. Thank you so much for listening. Do I have time for a few questions?
Thank you very much, Francesca. So do we have any questions? Okay.
Thank you very much for an excellent talk. You mentioned several times patriotism, and the question I want to ask is this. One of the most remarkable European thinkers warned Europeans some time ago that nationalism is not to be confused with patriotism. Under nationalism, I mean the habit of identifying oneself with a single nation or other unit, placing it beyond good and evil, and recognizing no other duty than that of advancing its interests. So, how you distinguish, and what do you think about this?
This is such an important question. And in my view, this is where, when we talk about the Ukrainian patriotism, or the Atlantic, for example, just ran a piece, said, oh, this is the rising nationalism of Ukraine and is a good thing. Well, it depends where you look at it from, right? Patriotism and nationalism, in my view, could really be the two faces of the same coin. The belief that you have the right to express your identity, the freedom to have a country and to have a territory, right? This might be patriotism. But for others that are fighting, for example, for protection of minority languages or minority rights, patriotism can be a very serious threat of nationalism. So in my view, the way in which, for example, Putin described this, now of course he compared it to Nazification, but the idea was, look, there is something at play in Ukraine that makes the Russian community, in fear and vulnerable. We are unable to protect those communities. Now, the way in which he went about is unacceptable, but I think It's important for the West to see both forces that coexist today in Ukraine. And nationalism and patriotism can be manipulated for political games very, very easily. I think the problem with Ukraine, of course, is that they are now a state in search of a nation, right? And the nation right now is what is disputed. You know, what is the identity of Ukraine? Is it a Russian identity? Is it a Ukrainian identity? Is it a European identity? And that process inevitably brings about a lot of violence in a lot of our peoples. So thank you.
Thank you. I want to do a little preface. The colleague who asked the previous question is somebody who knows me for a long time. I know him for a long time. And in a way, we represent the different sides of this coin. So that's very symbolic, I would say. My question is, you showed this slide with different regions, and this slide is very well known to people who follow Ukraine. This is so-called slide that demonstrates the deep division in the country, shown on many, many occasions by different political groups. So do you subscribe to this ideology that, or a view, and if it's a scientific view, what supports it, that there is a deep division, and that this deep division is caused by the prosecution of Russian minority?
So do I subscribe to that? Well, I go back to what the Minsk agreement was about. The Minsk agreement did recognize at some point that there are minorities that feel, whether right or wrong, that they feel insecure, they feel discriminated against. The decision, for example, of shutting down some Russian propaganda, on the one hand, of course, when you try to build a young country, right, you find this as a very dangerous threat to your national identity. But I also believe that for minorities, that could have been a serious threat or a sign that their culture, their identity was just not acceptable. I mean, for me, the big question that Ukraine will have to answer for itself is, are these two identities mutually exclusive or reconcilable? I think Zelensky came about with the understanding that, yes, there were some grievances that needed to be addressed. But I think with the Crimea, with the militarization of the conflict, he, in a way, was convinced that by implementing the Minsk agreement, it would have actually entrenched even further forces that he actually wanted to discourage. So I do believe that there are communities in the south and east of the Ukraine that do feel Russian, yes. I've seen in my own country, in Italy, the north part of the country, in some regions, they feel more German than they feel Italian. And the Italians solve this by giving them an autonomy of language, autonomy of, religion, and so on and so forth. But remember, Ukraine is in a different situation, right? You are trying to build a nation state from the ground up. You are almost at the birthplace of Ukraine today. It's a very young democracy. And so those forces unleashed at that moment might constitute a real threat to what the project has been, which is building Ukraine. Now, I have to tell you that talking to the Russian, or some of my Russian colleagues, in fact, the most moderate, I have to say, one of the things that they argue about was they basically stated that there was a missing opportunity with the Minsk agreement, that they should have deployed peacekeepers from the United Nations along those regions, right, and try to protect those populations. Now, this would have been never acceptable for us, right, because that would have somehow signaled that this belongs to Russia, or that somehow, compromised the integrity of Ukraine. But that tells you, right, that tells you the deep fracture politically within this country. So I don't know. So I also participated in a talk show in Italy, I have to tell you, a few months ago. Italy is a pro-Russian country. And there was a journalist, which I thought was actually pretty serious, who actually argued that there was a genocide in these republics. I mean, this is, insane things, but there were clashes. So do I believe there were a risk of, destruction? No, but I think there were deep grievances that, in my view, the West has probably a little bit underestimated. So I think we could have done a better job really understanding a little bit how deep those grievances were in some of these communities.
Okay, one more question.
Thank you for a very interesting talk. In the same line of reasoning for these pro-Russian regions, I was wondering, the war will have had some profound impact on the identity of people who felt pro-Russian before the war, and I was wondering if that has either entrenched it more in one or the other direction, or if you even have a feel for that at this point.
Yeah, so we will only know, can I tell you, many years from now exactly what the impact is. But already the Crimea War had, the occupation of Crimea War, we do know, has had a very important impact, especially in the political thinking of the elite, right? If you look at, for example, the trajectory of Zelensky, at the very beginning, he talked about, when he wasn't even still a politician, but he talked about this idea of community building, of, space for minorities. And then when I think Crimea occurred, the sense of insecurity, right? This is a survival mode for the state. Ukraine might not remain as one country, then tilts the balance. And this is when he takes over, then he decides the security sector reforms, really to eliminate any pro-Russian interference. So I think he will have a very deep, in my view, a very deep impact among the new generations. But so did, if we are serious, so did the Orange Revolution and the Maidan Revolution for the pro-Russian forces. This idea of this young, urban, middle class, young, talented, professionals, they wanted to become European, they were looking towards the West. If you sit in the southeast of the country and you're pro-Russian, then you really feel that you are at loss, right? Where is my country going? The real issue to me is there was, in my view, a different way to deal with it. But militarizing the conflict ends up entrenching those forces, and it will take decades. That is why, for me, the talk here is to say, look, don't kid yourself. We can eliminate Putin tomorrow, we can talk about NATO enlargement, but those forces have been unleashed. These are here to stay. And the way in which we think about reconciling them is going to take a big project of reconstruction. A lot of years will go into this.
Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much.
Our third speaker today is Daryl Kimball. Since 2001, he has been the executive director of the Arms Control Association and publisher and regular contributor for the organization's monthly journal, which is widely known and respected. That's Arms Control Today. For more than 2 decades, Arms Control Today, Daryl has led the ACA's education, research, and policy advocacy campaigns on a range of issues. These have included cancellation of new nuclear weapons programs, negotiation and ratification of the 2010 New START agreement, and efforts to promote entry into force of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. Other campaigns he has led have sought to strengthen implementation of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and the taboo against chemical weapons. Daryl is a frequent expert source for reporters and policymakers and has written and spoken extensively about nuclear arms control, disarmament, and non-proliferation. Today he will speak to us about the growing nuclear danger and options for stepping back from the brink.
Thank you very much, Fred.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone, for being here today. It is a pleasure to be here in Las Vegas in particular, where we're just 65 miles away from the site of some 928 U.S. nuclear test explosions. So this is a very appropriate venue for a conversation about the growing nuclear danger and options for stepping back from the brink. I'm going to bring together some of the issues and the questions that Rose Gutmuller brought up, and it's very helpful to have Francesca's review of the situation leading up to February 24th, 2022. Russian President Vladimir Putin's decision to launch this massive assault on Ukraine has, of course, led to a war that's killed thousands and displaced millions, and it has raised the risk of nuclear conflict. Putin's implied threats of nuclear weapons use against any who would interfere have raised the specter of nuclear war in ways that we've not seen since the end of the Cold War. And the war has also put on hold the U.S.-Russian dialogue on nuclear risk reduction and arms control, which has been and continues to be essential to heading off an all-out global arms race. The last remaining treaty, as we heard from Rose Gutmuller at the beginning, limiting the United States and Russian long-range nuclear arsenals, the strategic nuclear arsenals, the new Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, expires in just under 3 years and is under tremendous stress. And I'm going to come back to this issue, but one thing that I will, one conclusion I'm going to bring up to the front here is that unless Washington and Moscow begin talks, serious negotiations on a new nuclear arms control framework, the U.S. and Russian arsenals will be left unconstrained for the first time since 1972, making an already dangerous relationship more difficult to manage. So first, I'm going to talk about the nuclear dimensions of the Putin's war in a little bit more detail. And as we all will recall from a year ago, President Putin issued a number of threats in the past year, in February, April, and again in September. He made veiled threats of nuclear weapons use in the event that any state attempts to interfere with Russia's military assault. And specifically, he said, no matter who tries to stand in the way, they must know that Russia will respond immediately and with consequences that will be such as you've never seen in your whole history. And then he later announced on February 27th that he was ordering Russia's long-range nuclear forces on a special regime of combat duty, which was yet another provocative way of signaling that he might use nuclear weapons if NATO or the United States got involved. Now, during the Cold War, of course, the United States and the Soviet Union issued various kinds of nuclear threats and alerts. That by itself is not new. But since the dissolution of the Soviet Union, no U.S. or Russian leader has raised the alert level of nuclear forces to try to coerce the behavior of a potential nuclear adversary's behavior. And it was also shocking, of course, because this is 30 years after the end of the Cold War. And millions of people around the world were reminded that nuclear weapons still exist. And many people, millions, were reminded of the fact that the nuclear threat has not gone away. Now, to his credit, I believe President Biden has not responded by issuing reciprocal threats against Russia or raising the alert levels of U.S. nuclear forces. Instead, he's reaffirmed that the U.S. and NATO forces will not become engaged directly in the war. That is clearly an effort to try to avoid escalation while providing military assistance to help Ukraine defend their country. Back in October, the White House emphasized we will not be intimidated by Putin's nuclear rhetoric. That kind of approach has taken the punch out of Putin's nuclear threats and helped ensure the Russian nuclear bully doesn't get his way. But I would also note that in the early weeks of the invasion, Biden simply referred to Russia's threats as occasional nuclear rhetoric and as dangerous and extremely irresponsible, which implied, of course, that some types of nuclear threats are responsible, right? And the United States and NATO, of course, exercise, and as we heard from Rose Gutmuller, former deputy head of NATO, they exercise similar deterrent strategies that rely on the credible potential use of nuclear weapons under extreme circumstances. In July, France and the United Kingdom and the United States expanded on this theme at the Nuclear Nonproliferation Review Conference. They said in a working paper that their nuclear weapons only serve defensive purposes to deter aggression and prevent war. Now, not surprisingly, Russian officials at that same Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty Review Conference in New York They claim that Putin's nuclear warnings also serve defensive purposes and were simply designed to deter Western interference in their special military operation in Ukraine. Now, in contrast to the caveated criticism from the United States and London and Paris, yes? I can't figure out how to do it. Aha.
It takes a woman to fix it.
Yes, well. And someone who uses PCs and not Macintoshes, but that's another issue. All right. So in contrast to the caveated criticism from the United States and the UK and France, many leaders of non-nuclear weapon states recognize that Putin's brazen nuclear threats in the context of the war required them to speak with much greater clarity to avert catastrophe, and they did. In June of 2022, the states parties to the 2017 Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, the TPNW, issued a strong statement noting that, quote, any use or threat of use of nuclear weapons is a violation of international law, including the Charter of the United Nations, unquote, and they condemned unequivocally any and all nuclear threats, whether they be explicit or implicit and irrespective of the circumstances. Okay, now, Francesca, I need to get this down. Here we go. All right. There we go. So, nevertheless, as Russian forces were in retreat in eastern Ukraine in September, Putin suggested, he made another nuclear threat, and he suggested that he might order the use of shorter-range nuclear weapons, also known as tactical nuclear weapons, quote, if the territorial integrity of our country is threatened, including the territory of Ukraine that Russia had illegally seized just that month. This is not a bluff, he added. So in this context, in September of 2022, Putin was implying that if he believed there was an attack on Russian territory, perhaps the 4 oblasts that Russia had declared that it was annexing that September, he might order the use of tactical nuclear weapons to, he didn't say this, but this is what it was clearly intended to signal, to decimate Ukraine's defense forces or its cities, to demonstrate Russian resolve, and or attempt to force Ukraine and its allies to surrender. Now, Putin's September threat clearly veered from Russia's official nuclear doctrine, which reserves the option to use nuclear weapons in response to an attack with weapons of mass destruction, or if a conventional war threatens the, quote, very existence of the state. Now, the state of Russia, that is Moscow and homeland Russia, were not at risk, but these new territories might have been. So in response to Putin's stronger nuclear threat rhetoric at the time, key leaders and nuclear experts began to speak out in much starker and more direct terms against these threats, and for good reason. So if you recall, President Biden, in an interview on 60 Minutes that aired on September 16th, he was asked what he would tell Putin if the Russian leader is considering using nuclear weapons in the conflict. He said, don't. He also said that the United States and Russia were closer to nuclear Armageddon at any point than would been since the Cuban Missile Crisis. A few days later, the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, disclosed that he had warned Russia of, quote, catastrophic consequences if Russia uses nuclear weapons. Now, I don't know where you all were at this point, but for those of us who have worked in this field for a long time, I must say this was one of the most worrisome moments in my career, because we had never gotten quite this close to potential nuclear weapons use since the end of the Cold War. This was a very difficult moment. And so it's also important to remember what the world said and did in that moment. And some of the statements that came afterwards, I think, were very critical in at least temporarily reducing the threat of nuclear weapons use in the context of the war in Ukraine. So on September 27th, NATO Secretary General Stoltenberg, he weighed in And he borrowed from the terminology that the non-nuclear weapon states at the TPNW meeting had used back in June. Stoltenberg said, quote, any use of nuclear weapons is absolutely unacceptable. A very, very strong statement for a NATO Secretary General whose alliance depends, according to its doctrine, on the credible threat of nuclear weapons used to defend the alliance. Even Chinese President Xi Jinping said on November 4th that the international community should, quote, jointly oppose the use of or threats to use nuclear weapons, unquote. And then, also very importantly, the powerful group of 20 nations on November 16th issued a statement at their summit in Bali, Indonesia, declaring that the use of nuclear weapons and threats of use are, quote, inadmissible. So this is not the same as unacceptable. This was a compromise word, apparently, from some of the nuclear armed states and the non-nuclear weapon states as an alternative to unacceptable. But it is clearly a very strong term. And we have to remember the G20 includes states such as Brazil, India, Indonesia, Japan, Mexico, Saudi Arabia, South Africa, South Korea, Turkey, the United States, and European powers, of course. And the reason why this statement was very powerful is that many of those states have been neutral in the war, over the war in Ukraine, and have not been especially critical of Russia's invasion, or at all. So how did this affect Putin? Now, it's not clear that these statements by themselves were pivotal, but it is pretty clear that they were a factor in Putin's thinking. By the end of 2022, Putin appeared to back off his threats of nuclear weapons use. He said in October, quote, we see no need to use nuclear weapons in Ukraine. There is no point in that, neither political nor military. So in my view, and in the view of many others, including the German government, the U.S. Director of National Intelligence, Bill Burns, this rhetorical treat was no accident. Undoubtedly, Putin's advisors, as well as U.S. and NATO leaders, reminded Putin that there is no military value in using nuclear weapons against Ukrainian targets. These are mass terror weapons rather than weapons that could be used against specific military targets. Instead of ending the war, such an atrocity would almost certainly draw NATO into the conflict, which is the very thing that Putin was issuing his earlier threats against earlier in 2022. It could bring about Russia's defeat as a result of that direct NATO involvement in the conflict. It could bring about Putin's own downfall in the Kremlin, depending on the reactions within his own inner circle and within Russia. It could also bring about, of course, Armageddon, nuclear war, as President Biden said very publicly just a few weeks earlier. Now, since that time, since the fall of 2022, it is pretty clear that the threat of nuclear weapons use by Russia in the conflict itself against Ukraine has receded. But it is still possible, in my view and the view of many others, that before the fighting ends, and as Francesca reminded us, the fighting is nowhere near an end, we could see, once again, Vladimir Putin threatening the use of nuclear weapons, at least, to try to achieve some military or political objective. Especially, let's imagine, if this brings anticipated military offensives and counteroffensives, produce another shambolic retreat by Russian forces, and Putin fears once again a humiliating loss of territory or military capacity, he may once again resort to using nuclear threats or may even decide to use nuclear weapons in a last desperate attempt to turn the tide. I would also note there are other pathways to escalation. Rose Guttmuller spoke about this a bit, but more specifically, we have to remember that this is a major war in the center of Europe. The airways and the sea lanes are highly contested. There are NATO forces, reconnaissance aircraft, supply aircraft, and ships about. Russia also has a large number of forces in very close proximity. And so a close encounter between NATO and Russian warplanes that leads to an attack by one on the other, by miscalculation, for instance, could lead to a larger conflict between NATO and Russian forces. And the final thing I would just mention about that scenario is that, we hear about limited nuclear weapons use by some commentators and military analysts. The reality is that once and if nuclear weapons are used in a conflict involving two nuclear-armed adversaries, the United States and Russia in this case, there's simply no guarantee that it would not quickly become an all-out nuclear conflagration. There's a very interesting, I would encourage you to take a look at it. It's online, Princeton Program of Science and Global Security simulation called Plan A that estimates what would happen if nuclear weapons were used in a limited way to start in a conflict between NATO and Russian forces. The result is quick escalation, leading to the death and injury of nearly 100 million people in just the first few hours. And in the days and weeks beyond, of course, there would be many more hundreds of millions of people who would be affected by the fallout and the atmospheric effects and the effects on agriculture and food supply. Now, let me switch a bit here to address the impact of Russia's war on disarmament diplomacy, which Rose Gutmuller also talked about a bit. And she was talking about, and I agree, that the nuclear dimensions of the war in Ukraine makes it all the more vital that the Russians, NATO, and the United States leaders maintain lines of communication to prevent conflict. And unfortunately, the decision to invade Ukraine in February has limited communications necessary for the two sides to maintain good communications to avoid the kinds of inadvertent fighting that could still occur. There was a strategic stability dialogue that was going on prior to the war that was suspended immediately afterwards by the United States. Strategic stability dialogue meaning discussions to prevent the possibility that one side or the other believes the other has a strategic advantage that could lead to the use of nuclear weapons. Those talks were supposed to lead to formal negotiations on a new treaty to supersede the new Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, which will expire in early 2026. So, and New START is the last remaining treaty, as I said, between the United States and Russia limiting their strategic nuclear forces. New START keeps each side below the deployed strategic warhead limit of 1,550. And from this chart, you can see that in September, when this last declaration, this last exchange of information about the stockpiles occurred, Russia was one warhead below the warhead limit at 1,549 deployed warheads. It also limits each side to no more than 800 deployed and 700 deployed delivery systems, no more than 800 total delivery systems. Those are the long-range sea-based, land-based ballistic missiles and strategic bombers. So these limits have been in place since 2010. The treaty was extended in February of 2021 by mutual agreement of Putin and Biden to extend it by an additional 5 years. And even though the two sides cut off that strategic stability dialogue between the two in February of 2022, on June 2nd of 2022, President Biden said in a message to my own organization at our conference that year, he said, quote, "Even as we rally to hold the world to hold Russia accountable for its brutal and unprovoked war in Ukraine, we must continue to engage Russia on issues of strategic stability," unquote. And at the time, Vladimir Putin seemed to agree in general. He said on June 30th, "Russia is open to dialogue on ensuring strategic stability, preserving agreements on the non-proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, and improving the situation in arms control." But in recent weeks, Putin has intervened to block discussions between Washington and Moscow on a resumption of New START on-site inspections. There are supposed to be 18 inspections each year of each other's bomber bases, the missile bases on land and port. Those inspections were suspended in March of 2020 due to the pandemic. But they have been unable to reach an agreement about the procedures necessary to resume those inspections since then. And so just a couple of weeks ago, Putin announced on February 21 that Russia will suspend implementation of New START. That means that Russia will not exchange the bilateral declarations of warhead deployments, what you're seeing here on the screen. And he will not allow mutual on-site spot checks at missile and bomber sites. And Russia is not going to exchange missile test notifications that occur on a regular basis. There are dozens of these each week about what each side is doing with respect to their strategic arsenals. That is going to end. So this decreases the amount of insight we have and the insight that Russia has into each other's arsenals. And while we still can understand through national technical means what the Russians are doing, and they can understand what we're doing, it is not as precise as it would be if we had these data exchanges and these on-site inspections. So the other thing that is quite worrisome is that without these constraints, if New START is not replaced, the U.S. and Russia could, within a couple of years, double their strategic nuclear warheads to 3,000 or more by uploading additional warheads in their land-based and sea-based missiles. And they would be doing this without the benefit of the on-site inspections, without the exchange of data, and this would be I think, a policy decision that both sides would have to make, but this is the future that is possible without negotiated arms control agreements, or at least negotiated mutual restraints on the two sides' arsenals. Now, in our view, and I think in the view of the Biden administration and many U.S. allies and many other countries around the world, the United States and Russia can't afford to wait until Russia's war on Ukraine is over before engaging in these discussions. So far, in response to the suspension decision, the Biden administration has responded with prudence and restraint. Biden's described Putin's decision as a, quote, big mistake. And after Putin's decision, Secretary of State Blinken reaffirmed the U.S. remains ready to talk about strategic arms limitations at any time with Russia, irrespective of anything else going on in our relationship. So let me talk a little bit about some basic steps that we at the Arms Control Association and other experts in our field believe can help us step back from the nuclear brink, stepping back from the risk of nuclear weapons use in Ukraine or over the war in Ukraine, and how do we avoid an unconstrained nuclear arms race. And as we think about this, I think I would just argue that because there are no winners in a nuclear arms race or nuclear war, this is something of concern for people across the political spectrum, people in the technical community, the scientific community, and lay people in the United States and around the world. And it's important that we all think about how we can contribute to pushing back against any threats of nuclear weapons use and the renewal of disarmament diplomacy. And there are a large number of organizations that are already working on this as we speak, including my organization, the Arms Control Association, the Physicists Coalition for Nuclear Threat Reduction, which was established a couple of years ago. And I'm going to go through a 4-point plan for what we can do over the next year or two. So the first is that, as I was just discussing, the first step is to continue to try to convince Putin to return to the negotiating table. Despite the suspension decision, there's still time and opportunity to prevent a bad situation from getting worse. With strong U.S. leadership, especially working with U.S. allies and states in the non-nuclear weapons state majority, it's still possible to encourage Putin to work with the United States to secure a formal agreement to respect the central limits of New START until such time as a new nuclear arms control framework can be negotiated by the two sides. It's encouraging that many members of Congress are already supporting this kind of approach. But others are already calling for the U.S. to step away from New START and to prepare to increase the size of the U.S. arsenal, develop new types of nuclear weapons, such as the proposed nuclear-armed sea-launched land attack cruise missile. And some outside commentators are even calling for the U.S. to withdraw from New START before Russia does. Now, I would argue that U.S. withdrawal does not make the United States any safer or create leverage with Russia. Instead, it would lend credence to Russia's disinformation campaign about who's at fault for the breakdown of nuclear arms control, further escalate tensions. And if the U.S. and Russia broke out of New START, or if we don't negotiate a new agreement to follow up New START, China, which, as we heard before, is building up its arsenal, it would likely, it would be more likely to build up its arsenal beyond its current stockpile of about 400 nuclear warheads to ensure it can maintain a nuclear retaliatory capability. And U.S. International pressure is also going to be key, especially states outside of Europe and the United States, states that still talk to Russia, states that Russia still relies upon as it tries to prosecute its war and survive sanctions. China will be an important player. China, interestingly enough, has already called on the U.S. and Russia to return to negotiations over the inspections, resuming the inspections on New START, and to negotiate on a new nuclear arms control agreement. And one of the other things that's important and what makes this an international issue is, of course, the 1968 Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons. The deal between the nuclear haves and have-nots obligates all of the NPT states parties, especially the nuclear weapon states, to, quote, pursue negotiations in good faith on effective measures relating to the cessation of the nuclear arms race at an early date and on nuclear disarmament. The second thing that is going to be important to help us move back from the brink is further reiteration of condemnations of nuclear weapons use. As I said, this is not likely the end of the Russian nuclear threats of using nuclear weapons in the conflict in Ukraine. There are going to be opportunities coming up in the next few weeks and months where national leaders can express their views, including at bilateral meetings, multilateral summits, votes on UN resolutions, and other venues, including the G7 summit that's going to be taking place in Hiroshima, Japan, of all places, in May, and at the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty Conference taking place in August. The third thing that is going to be important, as Rose Gutmuller discussed earlier today, is a reestablishment of regular high-level U.S. nuclear risk reduction dialogue. Over the course of the nuclear age, this has been critical to resolving crises between the U.S. and Russia. We've relied upon, we've benefited from good luck, but also self-restraint and leader-to-leader dialogue. The two sides have a number of channels by which they can communicate, but they need to be using these direct lines of communication. One of them is a 1973 agreement, the U.S.-Soviet agreement on the prevention of nuclear war, which is something that very few people today even know about, and the two leaders of the two countries need to be reminded about. That agreement requires that the two countries refrain from nuclear threats and in times of increased risk of nuclear conflict, quote, immediately enter into urgent consultations with each other and make every effort to avert this risk. So that is something that the United States and Russia could invoke tomorrow in order to have a much more robust dialogue on averting nuclear weapons use. And then finally, another important part of this is the risk of nuclear weapons in Ukraine is not just an issue for President Biden to consider or NATO to consider. This is an issue that's going to concern the entire world, because the use of nuclear weapons by either side in any conflict is going to have global consequences. This is something that all states have a stake in, and they need to be prepared to respond to and ideally prevent. So one of the things that I think is going to be important, and there's some work being done on this at the UN, but there's not consensus, is if Russia, once again, threatens the use of nuclear weapons, UN member states need to pursue a strong, not just set of individual statements, but a strong uniting for peace resolution to overcome the crippling deadlock at the UN Security Council, to outline effective measures to restore the peace under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter. So this is something that has never been done before in response to nuclear weapons threats, but we are in unprecedented territory. So I want to conclude by just encouraging everyone here to continue to pay attention to this set of issues. We're going to have some difficult days ahead. I think we're going to have to be reiterating the condemnations against nuclear weapons threats and use, and we're going to have to find some creative ways to resume the U.S. and Russian dialogue on nuclear disarmament, or else we're looking at a much more dangerous future in which we might have unconstrained nuclear arms racing between the U.S., Russia, and also China. So thank you, and I'm ready for any questions if we still have
Yes,
time.
thank you, Daryl, for very informative and thought-provoking remarks. Are there questions?
Thank you for your remarks. I just had a few, brief questions that I wrote down. So you mentioned peace negotiations, which I myself believe is very important to end this war. And I believe both sides are both playing sort of chicken with each other in terms of communication. But what is your opinion on the president of Brazil's, proposal to Biden when he came to D.C., saying that oh, sorry, it's too loud. Okay. Saying that, he won't send tanks or weaponry to Germany because he wants to fight for peace, because this war doesn't help the people of Brazil or Latin America or the world. AMLO in Mexico also has similar position. And obviously China released their 12-point peace plan calling for peace in the region. And then just on the general question of arms control, what is your opinion on, fighting for a policy for the U.S. government to have a no first strike policy for nuclear weapons? Because I believe they're one of the largest, or the largest nation with the largest stockpile, and just don't have this policy, which is strange to me, if we're talking about democracy.
All right. Good question.
Yeah, and then the last thing real quick, and then the U.S. buildup of the military in Taiwan, which I think is related to this aggression in Ukraine with Russia, NATO, and such, because I think that's a very dangerous prospect for World War III. Thank you.
All right, well, let me take your first two questions, which are very good ones. I mean, I think one thing I would stress is that talk about talks for an end to the war itself, and talks about reducing nuclear risks between the United States and Russia and reducing arsenals they're related, but they're separate. Issues related to nuclear arms control transcend whatever else is going on in the relationship, and it's in the mutual interest of both sides to be talking about what they can do to reduce the danger to each side. But what has happened just in the last few weeks is that Putin has decided to try to leverage the United States' interest in that dialogue by pulling out of New START and saying that Russia is not currently prepared to negotiate new nuclear arms reduction arrangements with the U.S. I would just comment on the diplomacy and the talks about ending the war in this way. I think the Ukrainian side, the Russian side, they each want to appear to be peacemakers, but at the moment, neither side is prepared to end the fighting. There are other states like China that wants to appear to be a peacemaker, but it is taking a side by being neutral and being supportive of Russia. There are states such as Brazil that does not want to get pulled into this on one side or the other. They're trying to stay neutral. So I think we need to look at these proposals seriously, but we need to recognize that each of these countries has their own motives for putting some ideas forward. One of the other things you brought up is the provision of lethal military equipment by the United States and NATO, as well as other countries to support Ukraine's defense against Russia. And it has been very important, I think, in preventing an escalation of the war that Biden has made it clear that the weapons that are being sent to Ukraine are not all that capable of hitting territory in Russia, and that if they are, and some of them now are, that is an understanding with the Ukrainians that they're not going to be used to hit targets in Russia, which could provoke Russia to strike NATO supply lines and expand the war. So that's going to be another important and very difficult tightrope to continue walking, and it is not clear whether each side is going to walk that tightrope appropriately.
Okay. Another question over here. Yes.
Thanks for a very excellent summary of a lot of complex issues. Daryl, let me put it to you directly to follow up on that question of the first speaker. If Putin were to decide in a strategic battle that it is necessary for Russia to employ a very small, low-yield, tactical nuclear weapon in the battlefield, I assume, maybe it's just a hope, that the U.S., NATO is not going to respond in kind. Therefore, my question would be, what, in your view, would be the options really open now for the U.S. and NATO?
All right. That's a very good but very difficult question. Well, so first of all, I would note that Russia has a range of short-range nuclear weapons that are stored at central storage sites in Russia that would have to be removed from the central storage sites and put into forward deployment on systems that can deliver these weapons to targets, presumably somewhere in Ukraine. So one thing that might happen, it's not a certainty, is that the United States might be able to detect the movement of these warheads and issue a public warning and a private warning that we see this, thou shalt not do this, and to rally international opinion to try to stop it before it happens. So that's one thing that we might consider as we look at this scenario. One thing that would matter is, how does Putin use a tactical nuclear weapon and where? Is it 1? Is it 5? What is the yield? And most of the tactical nuclear weapons in the Russian arsenal are in the yield range of the bombs that destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki in the 15 to 20 to 40 kiloton range. Some are smaller, but some are in that city-busting range. So, where he uses them would be important. One reality is that Ukraine's military forces are not in one particular spot. They're dispersed. So there's no one particular geographic point at which Russia might use a nuclear weapon in order to stop an advance, at least not right now. So all of the conditions surrounding the actual use would matter in terms of the response. If I were in the room with the president, I would not like to be in the room in many ways, but if I were in the room, I would strongly recommend against a reciprocal nuclear response because that doesn't achieve any military objective. Where would we launch a retaliatory strike? Well, it wouldn't be in Ukraine, it would be in Russia. If the United States or NATO launched nuclear weapons hitting Russia, the Russians would reply, and we would be in an escalatory cycle that neither side could very well end, and we might wind up with that scenario I mentioned with 100 million people killed or injured within hours. The other alternative would be to use a conventional strike to hit at some appropriate targets, such as the base from which the Russian nuclear strike. That too would involve risks because we would be hitting targets in Russia. So, exactly what we do, there are no good options at that point. And what this leads me to think is we need to prevent this from happening in the first place. We will have all lost if we get to the point where Putin uses a nuclear weapon in Ukraine or anywhere else. So that's why these soft power mechanisms that I'm outlining here are they're important. They may not be decisive, but we need to use them. We need to restart the dialogue with Russia so that they know exactly what we would and would not do. And I would just also note that, we are going to be in a heightened state of nuclear risk for some time to come. I mean, I get asked a question, what is the chance of nuclear weapons being used in Ukraine right now? I mean, there's no number we can put in this, I'm sorry, to say this to a bunch of scientists who think in numbers, but I mean, there's really no way to put a number on it, except to say that we're in a heightened state for some time to come, and we need to use every tool in our toolkit to reduce the danger.
Thank you. Is there one other question?
Thank you. My first question was going to be very much the same as the one you just answered. Thank you very much for that detailed answer. Let me put a different spin then. You didn't mention anything about the test ban, which I thought was interesting. And one thing that Putin might do, for instance, is set off a test as a stage of trying to put more pressure. What is the thinking in the arms control community about the stability of the test ban in light of these recent challenges?
Well, it's a good question. You can only pack so much into a presentation of a certain length. I didn't mention that because I think it is highly unlikely that Putin is going to use a nuclear test explosion as a signal of resolve. Okay, why? Because he knows that we know that Russia has nuclear weapons. If he detonates a nuclear, let's say, nuclear test detonation over the Black Sea as a way to intimidate Ukraine and Ukrainian forces and allies, what would that accomplish? I mean, I think that it would not accomplish very much in terms of Putin's objectives, and there would be huge downsides. So I just don't think that's a serious possibility. Now, just a few days ago when Putin announced the suspension of New START, he did say that the Russian nuclear test site will remain ready to use, if necessary, if the United States resumes nuclear testing. Now, he should not be engaging in that kind of nuclear chest thumping by any means. It's not helpful. But what he's basically doing is restating a policy that's been in place for some 30 years since the Russians ended nuclear testing in 1990. The U.S. ended nuclear testing in 1992, which is that each country has a test site that's not been fully closed within a few months that could be, under the order of a president, jumpstart an effort to resume nuclear testing. But both countries are parties to the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty of 1996. Neither side has any technical or military need or interest in resuming nuclear testing. So I think what Putin said just a few days ago is a bit of an empty threat designed really to pump up his domestic audiences who want to see Putin showing resolve against the West and showing that Russia is ready to respond to anything that the West can throw at Russia. So that said, the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty is not something that we should take for granted. We need to continue to find ways to reinforce the global taboo against nuclear testing. Even though the treaty hasn't formally entered into force, the verification system, the monitoring system, I should say, is operating through the CTBTO, the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty Organization based in Vienna, and the Global Seismic Network across the globe. But we can't take it for granted because there are potential threats down the line. So I hope that helps. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Daryl. Let's thank him again for an excellent talk.
All right, I'll let you handle that.
Yes. Well, our next speaker is Francois Diaz-Marin. He's the associate editor for nuclear affairs at the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. Previously, he was a MacArthur Foundation nuclear security visiting scholar at the Center for International Security and Cooperation at Stanford University, and a European Commission's named fellow. He's been a scientific advisor to members of the European Parliament on nuclear issues. He's a founding member of the Emerging Leaders in Environmental and Energy Policy Network of the Atlantic Council. Prior to academia, Francois spent 4 years as a research engineer in the nuclear industry in Paris and in Boston. During this time, he worked on the safety design of nuclear reactors and treatment plant to vitrify Hanford's tank waste from World War II and the Cold War nuclear weapons production. He holds degrees in civil engineering, environmental and sustainability sciences, and nuclear materials. He's an expert in geochemistry of radionuclides and nuclear security. And he reads, writes, and speaks French, English, Spanish, and Catalan. He will talk to us today about the new risks posed by nuclear facilities in war zones and how to reduce them. Once he gets the microphone.
Yeah. It's on. It's coming. Thank you.
Hi. Can you hear me correctly? All right. Thank you, Fred, for this introduction and the invitation to give a talk today. And I also want to thank the University of Illinois Physics Department for co-sponsoring this talk. Let's jump right in. So exactly 1 year ago today, Russian forces took control of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant in southeastern Ukraine. Zaporizhzhia is Europe's largest nuclear power plant and one of the 10 biggest such plants in the world. This plant seizure by Russian forces came after several days of intense fights around the plant. So what can we learn from 1 year of having nuclear facilities facing themselves in the middle of a war? What I'd like to do here is to give you an overview of some of the key events that happened at nuclear facilities in Ukraine over the past year, and then I will assess together those new risks, and finally I'll discuss measures proposed to reduce those risks. And we need physicists too, I think, not only nuclear policy experts. In this presentation, I will largely rely on our articles that we published at the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists covering those issues, this situation in Ukraine. A little bit closer? Yeah. All right. So, first for background, prior to the war, Ukraine was operating 15 reactors. Of those, 6 are already alone are at Zaporizhzhia, including 3 that were already in cold shutdown for maintenance before the invasion. So on the first day of the invasion, on February 24th, the State Nuclear Regulatory Inspectorate of Ukraine reported to the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, that Russian forces took control of all the facilities of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. The same day, data from automated radiation monitoring system showed heightened levels in the Chernobyl exclusion zone. Those are the red dots that you see on the screen. The Ukrainian regulatory body attributed the excessive levels to the disturbance of the top layer of the soil from movement of large numbers of heavy military vehicles that crossed that zone on the day before. It was reported later that hundreds of Russian soldiers had to be repatriated to Belarus for treatment for acute radiation exposure. They had dug trenches inside the contaminated area too, and it turns out that many of the soldiers who invaded the plant did not wear adequate safety protection equipment, and they were not even informed that they were entering into a contaminated area. As their armored vehicles disturbed the soil inside inhaled radioactive dust, likely to cause internal radiation in their bodies. So quickly after, the Russian forces shelled and seized the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant that hosts 6 Russian-designed VVER-1000. Those are pressurized light water nuclear reactors. The same day, a subcritical assembly at the Kharkiv Institute of Physics and Technology, the so-called Ukraine neutron source, was destroyed by Russian attacks. The facility contains very little radioactive materials and is always subcritical, which means that it doesn't have it doesn't release enough sufficient number of neutrons to sustain a chain reaction. The IAEA visited the facility, and as of November of last year, there was no indication of radiological release or diversion of declared nuclear materials. But shortly after that visit, the facility sustained another rocket attack. In July and August over the summer, there has been a series of shelling and drone strikes near and at the plant site of Zaporizhzhia. Ukrainian first, you see the green little square, which is where a Ukrainian military launched a drone strike on Russian forces stationed at the Zaporizhzhia plant. Shelling was also reportedly damaging the external power supply system, triggering for the first time, it happened many times thereafter, the emergency protection system of one of the 3 reactors, which was still operating at the time, number 4. Shelling also reportedly damaged the spent fuel storage facility in orange here, the small square, especially 3 radiation monitoring sensors that impairing the ability then to detect any increase of radiation. So with no information, it's very difficult to know what is really happening there. And also reported some damage to an off-site power supply line, forcing operators to disconnect the plant's 2 operating units, 5 and 6, from the country's electrical grid. Then on September 1st, the long-awaited IAEA mission arrived at Zaporizhzhia. This mission was very useful and allowed us, the world and the community interested in nuclear risks, to get a detailed assessment of the damage of the plant's buildings. The team of nuclear safety experts could also get inside some buildings, although it could not access all of them. So in the top left corner, you see a picture that shows damage caused by shelling to the elevated passage of Unit 6. The top right corner, you see military vehicles packed on the ground floor of the turbine hall at Unit 2. Of course, a fire brigade could not access that building if a fire was to start there. And as you can see, there was also damage from shelling at a storage facility that hosts fresh nuclear fuel and solid radioactive waste. The building is just 100 meters from Units 2 and 3. Shortly after this mission, like 2 days after, the IAEA published its report about the situation, which painted a grim assessment of Zaporizhzhia's safety and security. The IAEA was especially concerned about the physical integrity of the plant, of the off-site power supply lines, and of the radiation monitoring systems. Of course, the agency was also worried about the operating conditions of the plant staff. Prior to their visit, the IAEA inspectors used satellite imagery to assess possible damage to the plant's building so they could know what to check once there. So when they did that, these images also showed, you see a little white square here, which is zoomed a little bit. That shows armored military vehicles stationed under bridges, and those were only about 60 meters from reactor 5. These vehicles, as well as those inside buildings, were likely stationed there to escape satellite observation and drone attacks. So with the war in Ukraine, nuclear facilities are entering into a new territory, a new era. And think about that. You have the head of the UN nuclear safety watchdog, Rafael Grossi, facing an artillery shell near the largest nuclear power plant in Europe. So it's pretty scary. So what are those risks exactly that nuclear facilities are facing in war zones? Early in the war, nuclear power experts identified 4 vulnerabilities for nuclear reactors in war zones: the reactors themselves, the spent fuel storage pools, some supporting equipment such as the backup diesel generators, and the operating personnel. So then they assessed that those vulnerabilities may lead to an event, radiological event, or reactor accident caused by either a military mistake, human error, a loss of off-site power supply, or a loss of external coolant. And we'll discuss briefly those 4 risks now. Russian forces reportedly placed artillery and missile launchers in and around the plant near the Kakhovka reservoir, which helps with cooling the plant. They also reportedly used these weapons from inside the plant site to shoot at Ukrainian drones and at an industrial site, and also at the city of Energodar, which is the equivalent of Pripyat for Chernobyl. So it's the village where most of the operators used to live. The Russian military also had artillery units, such as the one that you see, the Grad and the Pion, all capable of reaching the plant. So from all these weapons deployed in the area, a military mistake is more likely to happen as time passes. A reactor containment, though, is designed primarily to sustain a huge internal overpressure, possibly produced by the reactor. But it is also designed to sustain external aggression. A containment building of a middle-sized pressurized light water reactor, like those at Zaporizhia, could resist the crash of a commercial airplane of about 300 tons, and at a speed, traveling at a speed of about 700 kilometers per hour. So this would correspond to approximately 1.7 tons of TNT equivalent. So we are talking about a 1 meter thick reinforced concrete wall. So that's a pretty sturdy building structure. The problem is that the same reactor is not capable of sustaining the blast pressure from those artillery. Not even mentioning the missiles such as the Toka-U that is being deployed in Russia and Ukraine at the moment. And analysts have shown that Russian missile strikes have not been that accurate so far in the war of Ukraine. And in fact, this happened at Zaporizhia. Soon after the IAEA mission left, the first mission was completed, shelling resumed, not only on the plant, but also now heavily on power lines and on the reactor buildings themselves. The problem is, as you know, if the containment is breached, the reactor core could potentially be exposed. So this picture shows the damage from shelling on the wall of the reactor building Unit 4 at Zaporizhia. We can even see the steel bars of the reinforced concrete structure. So, but penetrating the containment drilling is only one way to damage reactors. Another, and probably more likely, scenario that potentially would lead to a reactor accident could be a loss of external power, eventually combined with human error. Between September and February of this year, there has been at least 9 shelling attacks reported near or at Zaporizhia. And for those interested, the World Nuclear Association maintains a detailed a timeline of key events involving Ukraine's nuclear facilities. I invite you to check that. It's very useful. And so as a result of shelling, external power was lost, and reactors had to rely on emergency diesel generators or backup power line for their coolant system. Diesel generators are not inside the reactor building, and so they can be more easily damaged. Moreover, they are less reliable systems than nuclear equipment and can work only for a limited amount of time until they need to be refilled. And also remember that they are filled with diesel, and Russian military vehicles are also at the plant site, so they might steal some oil, diesel from those generators. We don't really quite know. So with that, and the last, of course, to add to the situation, the last backup line, power line that was connecting Zaporizhia to a nearby thermal power plant has been destroyed just last month. So with the energy infrastructure under near constant attacks, Russia is putting the burden on Ukraine that needs to produce power at Zaporizhia and other power plants in order to sustain the war effort and its population, but it does so at the expense of creating new risks. So the plant staff has been working under stress for over a year now. Still, details are difficult to obtain because the plant operators have avoided talking in public ever since Russian forces seized the plant. And for good reasons. According to sources at the plant, the workers are living through a deliberate policy of threats and intimidation by the Russian FSB, which controls the plant. Workers are stopped at checkpoints on their way to the plant and arrested for questioning or ordered to report the next day to the FSB office for interrogation. Even the director general of the plant has been detained and released only the next day without any explanation. Others, early on in the war, especially simply disappeared, never returning to their workplace. To make an already disparate situation worse, Russian occupation authorities are blocking the supply and distribution of humanitarian aid coming from mainland Ukraine. As a result, plant workers are exhausted and stressed out. And yet we know how human error is an important factor in nuclear accidents. A loss of external coolant, the water, could come from water level dropping at the Kakhovka reservoir, which acts as the plant's ultimate heat sink. Water levels could drop 2 ways: by draining the reservoir or by destroying the dam downstream about 100 kilometers along the Dnipro River. In October of last year, Russian forces were accused by the Ukrainian government of plotting to use mines to destroy that dam. So the problem is that no one, at the moment, of course, it didn't happen, but no one knows what Russian forces would do if they had to retreat further south. And also, since they seized the area, Russian forces have reportedly drained voluntarily the Kakhovka reservoir to the point that is something we can see on satellite imagery. Here you can see the changes on the shoreline after 1 year of war. So like it does with electricity, Russia has diverted a massive amount of water toward its controlled territories further south and to Crimea. This will affect, of course, the upcoming growing season because that reservoir is also used for irrigation. And Ukraine is a big exporter of grain, and also it can affect the plant safety. Because of the volume of the reservoir decreased significantly, the water temperature might also increase as a result this summer, which means more water needed by the plant to remove the same amount of heat, residual heat from the reactors. As a result, Ukraine's operator, Energoatom, might have to consider to put the 2 remaining units into cold shutdown this summer. For background, all 6 reactors have been shut down for at least several months, 4 in cold shutdown and 2 in hot shutdown. Reactor unit 5 and 6 are in so-called hot shutdown mode. And this is problematic because the coolant temperature is kept above the boiling point of water to produce steam for on-site operations. A problem with this mode is that the safety systems, some of them are become not unavailable or cannot be automatically actuated in this mode. So a hot shutdown mode cannot be maintained forever, as it is not a normal mode of operation. It is typically used during reactor refueling. So these create new risks in case of abnormal situation. The question now, of course, is how to reduce those risks. Efforts to create a ceasefire or demilitarized zone have not been successful so far. Moreover, the 2 conventions that are currently existing do not, offer very limited protection to nuclear facilities in regard to direct security threats. First, the IAEA Convention criminalizes offenses related to the illicit trafficking and sabotage of nuclear material or nuclear facilities, but this convention does not cover attacks made on nuclear power plants made by state militaries. On the other part, under the Geneva Conventions, if a civilian infrastructure is used for military purposes, it can become a legitimate military target. This could go as far as simply providing electricity to sustain a war effort. Moreover, the Geneva Conventions allow military to destroy so-called civilian objects, such as power plants, homes, and infrastructure, if this destruction occurs as collateral damage when the military attacks a legal target, such as an adversary's military base. Finally, the conventions from Geneva do not protect spent fuel storage or fuel reprocessing facilities, which also pose significant risks. So with the war in Ukraine, the risks nuclear facilities are facing have changed, and so should the current nuclear security regime. But with new risks comes new questions, new challenge on how to address that, and experts so far don't even agree about solutions. Some argue the current regime is sufficient, it just needs to be implemented. Others, on the contrary, say the war in Ukraine shows that a new legal framework is urgently needed to protect nuclear facilities. For instance, some have proposed to include the IAEA prohibition into a new convention. The problem is, as you can anticipate, it needs to be approved by all countries, including Russia. So a new convention may not affect what's going on in Ukraine, to which Russia is likely to oppose, especially if it mentions the case of Ukraine. But the unambiguous legal prohibition against targeting or attacking nuclear power plants could prevent future aggressions. Another important aspect is to also unambiguously delegitimize the use of this type of actions against nuclear facilities. Another idea that has been proposed has been to resume all the Obama-era nuclear security summits held between 2010 and 2016. This could create a sort of momentum and incentivize the international community to act now on those issues. But that's certainly not the only option. The international community needs new creative thinkers like students and particularly scientists who know probably how to address those issues from a technical point of view and to help solve those new challenges. And with that, I thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take questions. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you, Francois. Very interesting and somewhat disturbing information. Question here?
Yeah, thank you for a really interesting talk. Does, in a sense, codifying in, say, the Geneva Convention some sort of carve-out for nuclear power facilities incentivize the developing world to further nuclearify, to go nuclear in a sense, because then they know their electrical infrastructure wouldn't be at risk by hostile actors?
Yeah, thank you for your question. Any move you do in protecting and giving a special status for nuclear facilities would also give the incentive to protect under this kind of framework other kind of infrastructure that you could call are critical. And then, but a dam, for instance, I mean, if you destroy the dam that I was showing, it would be a human disaster too. And it would be an environmental disaster. So I'm not saying that one is worse than the other. Nuclear is special because also of the nuclear materials that you have inside. I mean, they are not easily, you cannot still spend fuel, of course. You cannot bring it into your truck and leave. But nuclear materials have to be managed in a certain way. And they are always, and they tackle also the imaginary and the link to nuclear nuclear weapons pretty quickly. But I agree with you that it's difficult to set limits on what to define. I mean, it will be difficult. The language might be interesting to have, but at that point, at least, a nuclear facility that would be explicitly helping a war effort can become a legitimate target under the current legal regime.
Other questions? I might ask a question. It seems that one of the difficulties in Ukraine is not intentional direct attack against the nuclear facilities, but rather that a military force that appears to be using them for protection as a hostage and therefore putting them in danger, much higher danger. Is there any prospect that could be addressed by some kind of international convention, or is that really beyond the realm of possibility?
Yeah, thank you for your question.
Of course, in wartime, you are at war, so you don't. It's hard to have these programs following the international law, and you have been seeing a lot of violations. Anyhow, yeah. It's true that using it as a shield, and we've seen the Ukrainian military using it drone strike. I mean, a couple of hundreds of meters far. I mean, a drone strike is more precise than that missile strike. But still, it's pretty. We are not that far from secret military state in this game. and the Russian military knows that, and that's why they are stuck in a lot of reactors over there, because they are spotted and targeted and they are far from reactors, so they establish
Are there other questions? Any other questions for Francois? Let's thank him again for a very interesting talk. Thank you, Francois. Well, our final speaker in this symposium is Sahil Shah, who is a senior fellow and program manager at the John Nolan Center on Strategic Weapons of the Council on Strategic Risks. He's based in London. He is also a senior Iran policy advisor at the European Leadership Network. At the network, he's advised senior government officials and others on strategic and nuclear risk reduction issues. He led the network's efforts to strengthen nuclear and regional diplomacy with Iran and advised on other key areas of nonproliferation, disarmament, and arms control issues. He's twice served as a policy and outreach consultant to the Office of Executive Secretary of the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty Organization in Vienna. Today he will speak about global implications of Russia's reinvasion of Ukraine for nuclear nonproliferation, arms control, and disarmament efforts. Please welcome him.
Can you hear me? No, I don't. Can you hear me? It's okay.
Lights are pronounced.
All right, can everybody hear me? Fantastic. Thank you, Frederick, the American Physical Society, the University of Illinois, and all others who made today's lecture series possible. I'm honored to be here today with 4 practitioners who I deeply admire. I now have the difficult task of their brilliant remarks and also keeping you all awake. Beginning around 40,000 BCE, the archaeological record shows that anatomically modern humans effectively replaced Neanderthals and remained the sole hominoid inhabitants at least across continental Europe. At about the same time and directly linked to this development, the earliest art was created. In 1940, 4 teenage boys stumbled, almost literally, from German-occupied France into the Paleolithic age. Over time, many versions of the story have emerged, but the gist of what happened was that they were walking through the woods when one of their dogs fell into a hole. When attempting to save the animal by descending into the hole after it, the boys discovered a cave with walls and ceilings covered with brightly colored paintings. With estimations of being over 20,000 years old, the now world-famous Lascaux paintings depict over 2,000 roaming bison, mammoth rhinos, lions, and other animals, and interestingly, only 1 human. The subjects of cave paintings like these from this era, which have now been found around the world, have always been humans and their environment. depicted according to the requirements of a society whose technology existed only in fusion with ritual and often magical contemplation. 20,000 years later, it is worth remembering this simply because little has changed. Technology exists only in fusion with ritual, and the tools we have often gain a sense of magical quality, including most recently the rise of artificial intelligence. Nuclear weapons are no different. They are now part of humanity's rituals and often have a magical presence, seen as the ultimate weapon to yield to deter any and all adversaries. If anything has been proven by the events outlined by those who spoke before me, it is that such interpretations of nuclear weapons must desperately be unpacked and countered if we want to have any chance of surviving. The present moment has reawakened imagery of nuclear weapons, but has also generated both, on one hand, fear of and disdain for nuclear weapons, and on the other hand, respect for and desire for more nuclear weapons. In a lecture in Orléans in 1955, French writer and anthropologist Georges Bataille suggested that the cave paintings discovered at Lascaux in a way announced the presence of humanity on Earth. The lecture that Bataille delivered recounted his personal visitation of the caves, and the manner in which he opened his talk has always stuck with me. He said, "The latest atomic experiments made tangible the notion of radiation invading the atmosphere and creating conditions in which life in general could no longer thrive. Even without war, the experiments alone, if pursued with a little persistence, might themselves begin to create these conditions. I do not intend to talk to you today about our eventual demise. I would like, on the contrary, to talk about our birth. I'm simply struck by the fact that light is being shed on our birth at the very moment when the notion of our death appears to us." A generation ago, many, including Bataille, alluded to the risks of nuclear annihilation. While the subjects of the Lascaux paintings made a way to reinsert themselves back into the world, their ritualized movements reignited for a new era and new generation to try to make sense of, the timing of their reemergence could not have been more poetically ironic to Bataille. Discovering elements of our birth as a human race, with our potential destruction playing in the background. I mention this because, as Daryl noted, the location of the meeting we are all gathered here for has a deep nuclear history that is worth reflecting on. Because once upon a time, not too long ago, thousands of people gathered across Las Vegas, some on the rooftops of the hotels that predate the ones we are all residing at, to witness these atomic tests. Cocktail parties were thrown as crowds drank until the early hours of the morning before standing in awe of the great demonstration of power that these tests seemed at the time to represent. Of course, there was little awareness of the grave humanitarian and ecological consequences that such tests would provoke, including on downwind communities here in Nevada and elsewhere. The Nevada test site, which is only 65 miles north of Las Vegas, is the most significant nuclear weapons test site in the United States and possibly the world. Nuclear testing, both atmospheric and underground, started here in 1951, spawning reports from the public, some of whom were awakened by the shockwave or who witnessed a blinding white flash or had described a borealis effect spread over the whole sky to the northwest. There were more than 1,000 atomic tests in Nevada's desert between 1951 and 1992, including about 100 above ground. But the one in January 1951 was the first in that succession. It was also the first test in the U.S. since an experimental atomic explosion 6 years earlier, known as the Trinity test. A few years ago, footage of these U.S. atmospheric tests resurfaced as our national laboratories attempted to salvage and scrutinize the now decades-old footage to recalculate the explosive power of the tests using more modern technology than was available at the time. It is no surprise that they found that the tests were in many cases 15, 20 to 30% more powerful than previously understood. When the footage was released, I wondered what the public might make of them. Similar to the Lascaux paintings, these films are not just images made for a specific job of recording and interpreting, but magnificent depictions of human innovation and power. They have a meaning and a significance which cannot be reduced to their original purpose anymore. But as we look at these films here, in this specific place, with this specific history, and in today's specific context outlined by my co-panelists, how do we make sense of them? Just as we try to make sense of artifacts in a museum or paintings in a cave. What emotions are invoked? After all, how emotions function in often unseen and invisible ways grant and withhold authority, and in doing so enable and also limit political circumstances. The same goes for the current moment surrounding nuclear weapons. Emotions can lead us to double down on the utility given to them and drive us to build more, or succumb to the reality that these weapons do not in fact make the world safer and must be demoted in their salience. As Lewis Dunn noted last year, at the core of the debate about nuclear disarmament and the pursuit of a world free of nuclear weapons is an assessment of comparative risks. The risks of a world with nuclear weapons compared to the risks of a world without nuclear weapons. The events associated with the invasion almost certainly will be seen both by advocates of the accelerated pursuit of a world without nuclear weapons and skeptics of nuclear abolition as validating their respective positions. Are these pieces of footage enough for us to realize how destructive and world-altering the use of nuclear weapons would be? Do we need to see the use of nuclear weapons in a war context to realize this again? For example, a tactical nuclear weapons use in Ukraine. What will it realistically take to shift mentalities? Scientists have helped us understand the gravity to which nuclear weapons have already reshaped the planet through the aforesaid tests that I said occurred near Las Vegas, but also in many other parts of the world. According to the Working Group on the Anthropocene of the Submission on Quaternary Stratigraphy, the term Anthropocene has been widely used to, quote, denote the present geological time interval in which many conditions and processes on Earth are profoundly altered by human impact. According to this scientific working group, there are several phenomena generally associated with the Anthropocene. Some of these phenomena include large-scale increases in erosion and sediment transport as a result of urbanization and agriculture, global warming and sea level rise, ocean acidification and oceanic dead zones, and rapid changes in the biosphere. Others include the global dispersion of pollutants or new minerals, rocks, and other materials. The Anthropocene is not currently defined as a geological epoch within the geological timescale, but the Anthropocene would be the first geological timescale unit to be characterized by a human-caused pervasive shift in the Earth system. The advent of the Industrial Revolution could be associated with the start of this geological period, as it coincides with the mid-20th century signals resulting from the great acceleration of population growth, industrialization, and globalization. But according to scientists, standard stratigraphic practice would require a significant, globally widespread, and abrupt signature to mark the beginning of a new epoch. While signals of global warming and climate change would be indicative of a start to the Anthropocene, scientists argue that these would be poorly defined and difficult to measure geological indicators. This is where the issue of nuclear testing becomes relevant to this discussion. The working group notes that the sharpest and most globally synchronous signal of a start to the Anthropocene may be the global dispersion of artificial radionuclides spread by nuclear explosions in the atmosphere in the early 1950s. The arrival of the nuclear age and the subsequent practice of nuclear explosive testing does not warrant the classification of a new geological time unit in and of itself, and has not caused an associated Earth system to shift on its own. However, the signatures from nuclear testing, particularly the dispersal of plutonium-239, coincide with the other phenomena previously described and is seen as a practical radiogenic signature of the start of the Anthropocene. And so humanity has now gone from one era to another and the next, and nuclear weapons have now played a large role in our current era and reshaping the planet and our existence on it to a remarkable degree. Although these weapons are now largely omnipresent for most, they are also very visceral to the communities who are still affected generations later by their testing and use. Some of those communities live here in Las Vegas and surrounding areas, and their voices should be elevated. They should be the ones who define how we talk and think about these weapons, as they are some of the few out there who know the risks and consequences of them. As we know from the archaeological record, the period the paintings at Lascaux were illustrated was one of relative peace amongst humans. No doubt there were homicides and tensions between and within human bands, but it would be at least another 10,000 years before the invention of war as an organized collective activity. Today, war has become commonplace around the world, with Russia's reinvasion of Ukraine being unique out of the many ongoing conflicts, in part because it has brought back nuclear weapons into the public consciousness, especially here in the United States. And the moment is serious. I firmly believe that we are in the most dangerous position we have been since that first Trinity test I mentioned all those years ago. At the end of the Cold War, countries, including our own, made a lot of progress in reducing the types of nuclear weapons that were out there, generating a lot more stability to doctrine and practice, trying to make sure that there was a solid norm against the testing and use of nuclear weapons, bringing the numbers of nuclear weapons in the world down from their Cold War heights, and more. In fact, there was seemingly so much progress that people often now dismiss the nuclear threat as having been dealt with, leaving these weapons largely within the purview of government and more specifically executive action. This diminishing public reckoning with the fact that grave risks remained and still do is now changing because of the war in Ukraine. Of course, as long as nuclear weapons exist, risks will indeed also exist. Unfortunately, there has been a near collapse of the nuclear arms control scaffolding that has been built up by the US and the Soviet Union and now Russia over the decades, increasing the chances of both horizontal and vertical proliferation, not just amongst the two, but more broadly. The US and Russia, although generally always at odds, have in previous eras at least been able to cooperate and communicate to ensure that the chances of miscommunication and misperception do not cause either to stumble into a nuclear conflict. They have also been able to cooperate closely to uphold the non-proliferation regime, but even that has been dragged down by Russia's actions, as some of my previous co-speakers outlined. If we zoom out of the war in Ukraine, there is growing commonality of nuclear risks across regions, which means that the Euro-Atlantic or greater European region, inclusive of the US, Europe, and Russia, is not unique anymore. Scholar Manpreet Sethi said it best. Really, all regions now share the risk of deliberate, premeditated nuclear war, of inadvertent nuclear escalation, of further nuclear proliferation, of accidents in nuclear weapons complexes, and of theft, leakage, or sale of weapons-grade material or technology to be used for nuclear terrorism. And today, these risks are also made more complex because of a few factors. New and emerging technologies, including non-nuclear technologies, and what effects these have on nuclear decision-making. New frontiers of war, including cyber and space. Increasingly varied nuclear geometry with multipolarity in play, and in particular, a rising and more aggressive China, which is seemingly providing a swing vote between the two sides of the dichotomy I've been touching on. And lastly, conventional weapons getting longer in range and greater in accuracy, becoming effectively indistinguishable from nuclear weapons until perhaps it's too late. In my view, out of all these developments, what is the most dangerous is the increased emphasis on these weapons as being war-fighting weapons rather than ones of deterrence. This is exemplified most starkly in the limited nuclear options in defense planning of the United States, Russia, and China, and the advent of the substrategic or tactical or battlefield nuclear weapons that some others have spoken about today. These are the weapons that that we have been worried about that Putin might use on Ukraine. In order to consider warfighting weapons at the lower ends of the scale, you have to believe in two things. One, that you have to deter at the same level, and secondly, that you can control the escalation ladder. If you don't believe in those two things, then you can't possibly believe in warfighting with nuclear weapons in a controlled way. I think the strongest indicator was when President Putin bashed his second nuclear saber in September timeframe of last year, and Jake Sullivan, as Daryl also noted, talked about catastrophic consequences, and President Biden used the word Armageddon. Neither of those two phrases are associated with like deters like, small against small. They were both strategic responses to the use of any nuclear weapons. So my conviction is that the strength of response, which said we would consider any use of nuclear weapon at any level to be such a trenchant change in the world order that we cannot discount that you would get a strategic response. And that is the only thing that made Putin think. Because if you're factoring nuclear weapons in like you do any other weapons in a gain-loss percentage, meaning how many people would die, when you're in that game, then you've already lost the deterrence battle. You're no longer thinking about deterring, you're into nuclear warfighting. And this shift, which the war in Ukraine has brought to light, and of course has of course negative implications on arms control, non-proliferation, and disarmament. However, all of these remain to be more important tools now than ever. We must focus on first reducing the immediate risks through warfighting weapons before beginning to lay the foundations for reductions in other more strategic weapons. If we reduce the risks first, by doing so we can strengthen stability, as the world is really not a safe place at the moment. And finally, we can hopefully create a bedrock for further disarmament, to the point where we only have strategic weapons and can start thinking about the very different issue of how to get from low to zero. In my judgment, we have got as far as we can go in reducing strategic weapons, such as they are the most significant factor. But they're no longer the most significant factor. We are either at a point of equivalence between strategic weapons and less than strategic, substrategic, or warfighting weapons, or at a point where the latter are even more significant to stability or instability. And in fact, if we further reduce strategic weapons at this point, we will just make the importance of those other weapons in instability terms perhaps more important. They're dangerous, largely dual capable, and very susceptible to misinterpretation or miscalculation. And they will likely be the triggers of the nuclear escalation that will be proven to be unstoppable. To do something about this multilaterally, it will require trust, which we don't have at the moment because Russia's reinvasion of Ukraine has essentially hollowed out the fragile trust that existed between the West and Russia and also amongst the wider nuclear weapon states. Scholar Michael Crepon noted last year, before he sadly passed away, during the Cold War, arms control agreements succeeded over time in breaking the cycle of increased nuclear threats and an intensified offensive-defense competitive dynamic. Many of these arguments were discarded in favor of the freedom of action after the Cold War ended. Today's headlines reflect prior choices, and arms control agreements now have very poor prospects. Prospects for revival depend on when leaders of the United States, Russia, and China concurrently conclude that unwelcome offensive and defensive trend lines need to be reversed. However, that is not to say that the US or the UK or France or any of the other countries could not unilaterally take steps without detriment to their strategic deterrence. But it would need a change in mindset about the necessity for these weapons of supposed warfighting use. It is unlikely that we will be able to do this until we can get Russia's large stockpile of these kinds of weapons on the table at all, but we need to work on that in an iterative process. Arms control is about strengthening mutual security, and there's a lot that can be done to get back to a place of greater stability, including in the near term, despite how challenging of a world we are facing right now. The collapse of the nuclear ecosystem that we've spoken about is part of a general slide away from an order which sort of gave an envelope in which these adversarial relationships could be managed. A shift away from that and the randomness of the way in which countries are interacting with each other at the moment, of which the war in Ukraine is just one example, is worrisome and highly unpredictable. The void of trust between the big players is also extending into other realms. The inability for the US and Russia to protect diplomatic space on nuclear issues from the war in Ukraine, which you've heard about from the previous speakers, means that it will be harder for both sides to communicate about and cooperate on other pressing nuclear challenges, such as Iran and North Korea. Using the former as an example, last year the US, Europeans, and Russia, along with China, all had worked tirelessly with Iran to come to a place where it may be possible to convince the complex political systems in both Washington and Tehran that restoring the 2015 nuclear deal would indeed be the win-win arrangement that it was always intended to be. It would get Iran to follow the nuclear restrictions that it had originally signed up for, and the US would reinstate sanctions relief. Alas, due to the invasion of Ukraine, the US and Europeans stopped speaking to the Russians stopped applying as much pressure to the Iranians, and are now even seeking arms from Tehran to use in Ukraine. And in the meantime, Iran has advanced their nuclear program rapidly, completely reshaping the dynamics at play. Israel, Saudi Arabia, and others in the region are closely watching. At the same time, we have countries like South Korea toying with the idea of procuring their own nuclear weapons rather than relying solely on the US nuclear umbrella, and North Korea developing its own arsenal further, and rumors of a forthcoming nuclear test. We have the 1-year anniversary this week of the BrahMos incident, when India accidentally fired a missile into Pakistan, with little progress in India-Pakistan risk reduction or arms control prospects despite that moment. The list sadly goes on, and a lack of a working US-Russia relationship certainly affects our collective ability to deal with many of these issues. A lack of a China willing to show leadership or responsibility in this area also will increasingly affect our collective ability to deal with many of these issues. To conclude, while cave paintings may have announced humanity's birth, the advent of nuclear weapons may indeed, as Battelle alluded to, have announced humanity's death. While the current rise in nuclear risks are only making that more of a potential reality, the clock has already been ticking for many decades, and we have not made it to where we are today alive because of nuclear weapons, but despite them. Sociologist Ian Morse predicts that in just a century, we will go through the equivalent technological tsunami of the journey from cave paintings to nuclear weapons. I repeat, in just 100 years, we will go through the equivalent technological transformation from cave paintings to nuclear weapons. Tens of thousands of years of development consolidated and condensed into a century. This rapidly accelerating technological environment is already completely changing the context in which nuclear weapons have historically operated and currently operate. The lack of dialogue on this particular subject amongst the US, Russia, China, and other players is alarming and should be amongst the top agenda items of when nuclear diplomacy gets back on track. And yes, I purposely have said when and not if nuclear diplomacy gets back on track, because we cannot afford to think of arms control, non-proliferation, or disarmament as simply dead. In the words of scholar Heather Williams, gathering like-minded states, strengthening alliances, and developing new ways to reduce nuclear risks are just a handful of the ways of standing up to the man in Moscow. Leading on arms control is an act of defiance in the face of Putin's attempts to tear down the rules-based international order. Leading on arms control in the midst of a crisis is hardly reckless. Rather, it's what responsible nuclear states do. If I can add to that, I would note that this mammoth, no pun intended, undertaking really could use some help. We need the scientific community and physicists in particular to help policymakers and publics better understand nuclear weapons, the risks they carry, and the new contexts in which they will operate. We really need your help. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Sahil, for a very eloquent talk. Are there any questions for him? Well, I have a question. Could you raise your hand? Sorry.
Do you have any opinion on the role of ballistic missile defense technologies in arms control discussions? No?
A really good question. Maybe I can also take your question at the same time, since we're running out of time.
No, please go ahead.
Yeah. This has always been a major factor in discussions and debates about how we can reliably get arms control to a place where both sides feel that there's some level of predictability and transparency and stability and trust. At present, it's going to be really difficult to see how we are going to get to a place where the U.S. is willing to talk about ballistic missile defense, but this is something that the Russians are very, very keen for us to talk about. And obviously, there's also things that we're keen to talk to the Russians about, but because of what's happened in Ukraine, the strategic stability dialogue that was created where we could actually talk about these things has been totally derailed. So I totally endorse the recommendations from Daryl and others that really needs to get back on track immediately so that concerns surrounding that can be discussed sooner rather than later, because the treaty that Rose was the lead negotiator on New START, it's not going to be with us forever. We only have a few years left. And we have to figure out what arrangements, even if it's not a formal treaty, that could be put in place to help try to put more and more guardrails around these weapons and to also reduce their salience and hopefully reduce their numbers as well.
Other questions? Well, perhaps I'll ask a question. What thoughts do you have about how to make the interpretation of current events by states that are potentially nuclear capable, like those in Asia that have the technology that could go in this direction, or the Arab states that have this possibility, to make the interpretation that nuclear weapons are undesirable rather than desirable?
That's a really good question. It all links back to the debate that I pointed at, which is what world do you believe will be a safer one? And I think that we have enough evidence to show that nuclear weapons are extremely risky, weapons to have in this day and age, and that there's going to be increasing complexity in the environments in which they operate. And they're also very expensive. They're quite clumsy in some cases. They're not necessarily the best use of time and resources. But there is obviously great promise to nuclear energy across medicine, agriculture, etc. And everybody should have equal access to nuclear energy for peaceful uses. But the thing is that at the same time, these countries have to also be able to be willing to sign up to the necessary safeguards, security agreements, safety agreements to make sure that the materials that are being used are indeed tracked and that they can't be diverted either covertly or otherwise for bad purposes. So I would say that it's a difficult case to make, especially when the big players are not working towards their commitments to get rid of these weapons. They are all meant to be working towards disarmament. And when they are doubling down and modernizing and perhaps expanding their nuclear arsenals, of course it's going to give what many see as a green light for others to also do the same. But again, it really links back to what kind of world we'd like to live in. And unfortunately, it's not an easy case to make during the current tensions.
Thank you. Okay. How would you recommend that physicists get involved?
That's a great question. There's lots of NGOs that are out there that work on these issues. There's also specific NGOs and communities of scientists that work on these issues. Daryl leads one of the most important ones, the Arms Control Association. But there, I think, is a lot of work that can be done everybody can make a difference, even if it's just within their own household, their own community, to be able to try to work through the meaning of these issues with the people that are around them. Of course, joining collective efforts and putting your weight behind ideas that will help us reduce nuclear risks is very valuable. But I think change starts, just within your own daily life, and paying more attention to these issues and really challenging a lot of the notions that we're seeing in the press, in the media, or even being promoted by governments. It's really important that we have more and more critical people out there who are trying to unpack the very premises that underpin the utility that these weapons are given. Especially in today's day and age when we have such heightened risk for them being used.
If I could just add to what you said, there is actually an organization called the Physicists Coalition for Nuclear Threat Reduction, and that was founded initially by the APS. And it is continuing on. It now has more than 1,000 physicists as members. A majority of them are young, early career physicists, and there are lots of actions that you can take as part of that organization. There are a lot of educational efforts, so that's something specifically for physicists to join in this enterprise. So I just encourage you to look into that at Physicists Organization on the web. Yes, there's going to be a talk at the IUPAP session by Stuart Prager, who is one of the leaders, like I, a co-founder of this organization. So if you want to go hear about that, that's at 4:50 p.m. tomorrow. You can learn about it in more detail. Thank you, Cheryl. Okay, well, let's thank again all the speakers for a wonderful symposium, and let's go forth and do something about this.